The night was cold, the wind howling through the pines, but the Mustang's body burned with fever. Dusty, once a strong and proud stallion, now trembled, his legs barely holding him up. His once glistening coat was matted with sweat and dirt, his ribs pressing against his skin like a skeleton wrapped in leather. A frayed rope dug into his neck, tying him tightly to the thick trunk of an old oak tree. The ground beneath his hooves was trampled and damp, his breathing shallow. He let out a weak, trembling whinny, a final cry for help. But the only response was the distant howling of wolves. Just a few feet away, Earl stood with a grim expression. He was a weathered man in his late 50s, his face hardened by years of ranch work. He adjusted his hat and exhaled through his nose, his breath visible in the night air. His hands were rough, calloused from a lifetime of handling livestock, but there was no kindness in them. He had made up his mind. "This ain't no charity," he muttered under his breath. "A sick horse's got no place on my land." Dusty had been a good worker once, strong enough to carry supplies up the mountains, fast enough to keep up with the best. But now? Now he was nothing but a burden. Earl had no time for weak things. He tightened his coat and took one last look at the Mustang. His wife, Martha, had begged him to give the horse more time. "He just needs rest, Earl," she had pleaded. "Give him a chance." But Earl knew better. A sick horse cost money. A sick horse slowed things down. And in the wild, weakness meant death. That's where Dusty belonged now, back to nature. Back to the wolves. Without another glance, Earl turned and walked away. His boots crunched over the fallen leaves, his heavy steps fading into the night. Dusty shifted, his legs wobbling, his body too weak to fight against the rope. He had no food, no water. Only the darkness of the forest and the sound of approaching predators. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure, silent and watching. A glint of steel, a rifle reflecting the moonlight. And a pair of eyes, filled with a quiet rage. Someone had seen it all. And they weren't going to let it happen. The wind carried the scent of blood and weakness through the trees, a silent invitation to the predators lurking in the dark. Dusty's ears twitched as he sensed movement beyond the tree line. A low growl rumbled in the distance, followed by the sharp snap of twigs. The wolves had caught his scent. His body shivered, not just from sickness but from instinctive fear. He had seen wolves before, but never this close, never while he was unable to run. His legs locked, his breath came in short, shallow bursts. The darkness pressed in around him. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. "Easy, boy." It was low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. A tall, weathered man stepped from the shadows. His face was worn by time, his beard dusted with gray, but his eyes were sharp, watchful, calculating. He held a rifle in his hands, but it wasn't aimed at Dusty. Instead, he slowly approached, gaze flicking between the Mustang and the forest behind him. Jed. For years, Jed had lived on the outskirts of town, an old rancher who kept to himself. Most folks had forgotten about him. But he hadn't forgotten about them, especially not Earl. He stopped just a few feet from Dusty, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The Mustang flared his nostrils, his weak body tensing, but he didn't pull away. Something in Jed's presence made him hesitate, not fear, but familiarity. Jed's hands were steady as he reached for a pocketknife. He could feel the Mustang's exhaustion, his ribs pressing against his sides with each labored breath. The rope had been tied tight, meant to hold Dusty there until the wolves finished him. But not tonight. Jed cut the rope. Dusty's legs wobbled, and for a moment, Jed thought the horse might collapse right then and there. But he didn't. Somehow, even in his weakest state, the Mustang remained standing. "Got more fight in you than I thought," Jed muttered. The wolves were getting closer. He could hear them now, the crunch of leaves beneath paws, the soft whines of excitement. Jed knew how these things worked. A sick horse wouldn't last long out here, not without help. But why would Earl do this? Jed knew the man well, too well. He knew Earl's temper, his greed. But this? This wasn't just about a sick horse. This was something else. Dusty let out a weak exhale, his eyes heavy. He wouldn't last long on his own. Jed sighed, rubbing his jaw. Guess you're coming with me, then. He pulled on the rope, guiding Dusty forward. The Mustang hesitated, his legs unsure, but something in Jed's steady presence pushed him forward. As they disappeared into the trees, a pair of eyes watched from the darkness, not wolves this time. Someone else had seen everything. And they weren't happy. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls of the small ranch house. Martha sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly together. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the time since Earl had left for the woods. She already knew what he had done. Her husband had been cruel before, he had let cattle starve to save on feed, had worked horses until their knees gave out. But this? Tying a sick Mustang to a tree, leaving it for the wolves? It was different. She had begged him not to do it. Earl, she had said that morning, voice shaking. He's not just some old nag. He's got fight left in him. But Earl had just scoffed. Fight don't make a sick horse worth keepin'. Now, as she sat alone, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, anger. The front door creaked open, and heavy boots stomped against the wooden floor. Earl walked in, dusting off his coat. His face was expressionless, as if he had done nothing more than take out the trash. Martha stood. You did it, didn't you? Earl sighed, shaking his head. Ain't no point getting worked up, woman. Horse was done for. Martha clenched her fists. You don't know that. Earl didn't respond. He just hung his hat on the wall and walked toward the table. But Martha wasn't finished. She stepped in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. You lied, she said. Earl narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? She took a deep breath. It was time. I know what you did, Earl, she said, voice trembling with both fear and fury. And I know why. For the first time that night, Earl hesitated. His jaw tensed, his eyes darted to the side. Martha pressed on. That Mustang, it wasn't just another workhorse, was it? Earl's lips tightened into a thin line. Don't go startin' somethin' you don't understand, Martha, he warned. But she wasn't backing down. I understand plenty, she said. I understand that Dusty wasn't just some sick horse to you. You wanted him gone because you were scared. Earl slammed a hand on the table. Enough. But Martha wasn't finished. She took a slow step forward, her voice now deadly calm. Tell me, Earl, she whispered. What are you so afraid of? Earl's nostrils flared, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He had buried the truth for years. But now, standing before his wife, her eyes burning with accusation, he realized something. The past wasn't done with him yet. And neither was Dusty. Jed led Dusty slowly through the woods, his steps careful, deliberate. The Mustang was weak, too weak to move fast, but he still walked, even when his legs shook beneath him. Jed muttered to himself, shaking his head. Damn fool, he grumbled, thinking of Earl. Some men don't change. The old rancher had seen plenty of cruelty in his time, but there was something different about this. This wasn't just about getting rid of a sick horse. This was personal. And Jed knew why. He stopped at a clearing near his small, worn-down cabin. It wasn't much, just a single-room home, a small barn, and a rickety fence, but it was all he needed. It was home. Jed grabbed an old blanket from the barn and laid it over Dusty's back. The Mustang barely reacted. His body sagged, exhausted, but his eyes held something else, a will to survive. Jed saw that same look once before. Years ago. He ran a hand over the horse's neck, feeling the faint scars hidden beneath the dust and sweat. That's when it hit him, he had seen this horse before. Not just any Mustang. Dusty. His chest tightened. Jed swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had suspected it back in the woods, but now, seeing the marks on Dusty's coat, he knew the truth. "Boy," he whispered. "What the hell did that bastard do to you?" His fingers traced the faint scars, the kind left behind from old abuse. Dusty had once belonged to him. Years ago. Jed had worked for Earl when they were young men. Back then, Earl wasn't just some cruel old rancher, he was ambitious, ruthless, always looking for a way to get ahead. Jed had raised a Mustang colt on that ranch. A strong, proud animal. He trained him from birth, bonded with him in a way few men ever did with their horses. But Earl didn't care about bonds. He cared about money. One night, when Jed returned from a supply run, the Mustang was gone. Earl claimed he had been stolen by rustlers. But Jed knew the truth, Earl had sold him, pocketed the money, and lied. Jed had left the ranch that night and never returned. And now, standing in front of this sick, abandoned horse, he realized. Dusty was that colt. Earl had gotten rid of him once. And now, years later, he had tried to do it again. Jed clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. Earl had stolen everything from him. And he had almost taken Dusty's life too. Not this time. Jed turned toward the small cabin, his mind made up. He wasn't just going to save Dusty. He was going to make Earl pay. But before he could take another step, something in the trees moved. Jed froze. His hand went to his rifle. The wolves weren't the only ones watching tonight. Someone was out there. And they were getting closer. The air was still, but Jed's instincts screamed at him. Someone was there. Slowly, he turned, his fingers tightening around the rifle. The trees rustled, but it wasn't the wind. The movement was deliberate, calculated. Jed wasn't a man who spooked easily, but something about this felt off. A shape emerged from the shadows. Martha. Her coat was pulled tight around her, her hair undone, her face pale from the cold. But her eyes were wild with urgency. "Jed," she breathed, stepping into the clearing. "It's you." Jed's grip on the rifle loosened slightly. "Martha?" She looked past him, and when she saw Dusty, something flickered in her expression, relief. "You saved him," she whispered. Jed narrowed his eyes. "How'd you know?" Martha hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be following. Then, she stepped closer. "Because Earl came home and lied to me," she said. "He told me the horse was gone, that it was done. But I knew something was wrong. I had to see for myself." Jed studied her. He'd known Martha for years, back when she was just a rancher's daughter, long before she married Earl. She wasn't a cruel woman. But she had stayed with a cruel man. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice low. Martha flinched, but then she lifted her chin. "Because," she said, her voice thick with something heavy, regret. "I should have stopped him a long time ago." She looked at Dusty, who stood weakly but alive. And then she looked at Jed, her expression shifting. "There's something you don't know," she said. "Something about Earl. About why he's doing this." Jed crossed his arms, waiting. Martha swallowed hard. "Dusty isn't just a horse to him," she said. "He's a problem." Jed stiffened. "What the hell does that mean?" Martha looked toward the trees again, then took another step forward. "Jed," she whispered. "He knows. He knows Dusty belonged to you. And he's afraid." Jed's heart pounded. Dusty wasn't just some sick Mustang to Earl. He was evidence. Evidence of what Earl had done all those years ago. Evidence that he had stolen, lied, and ruined lives. And now, Earl was desperate to make sure the past stayed buried. Jed's jaw clenched. "Where is he now?" Martha hesitated, then whispered, "Coming for you." The moment the words left her lips, something cracked in the woods behind her, a gun being cocked. Jed's blood ran cold. Martha's eyes widened in fear. And then, bang! A gunshot shattered the night. Dusty reared up, his weakened legs barely holding as the echo rang through the clearing. Jed grabbed his rifle, eyes darting toward the darkness. But he already knew. Earl had found them. And he wasn't alone. The gunshot echoed through the trees, a sharp crack that sent Dusty stumbling back. The Mustang's legs wobbled, his breath ragged, but he didn't fall. Jed dropped into a crouch, rifle ready, eyes scanning the darkness. Where was he? Martha stood frozen, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Jed," she whispered. "He's here." Then, another voice cut through the night. "I see you, old man." "Earl." His voice was slow, deliberate, dripping with satisfaction. Jed's grip tightened around the rifle. He didn't move. He'd been in situations like this before, facing down predators, waiting them out. And Earl was no different than a cornered wolf. The crunch of boots on leaves. A shadow shifting between the trees. Then Earl stepped into the clearing. His coat was drawn tight, his hat pulled low over his eyes, but his shotgun was raised, aimed right at Jed. Behind him, two men followed, hired hands from his ranch. Both armed. Both looking mean. Jed knew their type. Men who followed orders. Men who didn't ask questions. Earl smirked, his shotgun still leveled. "You just don't know when to quit, do you, Jed?" Jed stayed quiet, steadying his breath. Earl's gaze flickered to Dusty, and something dark passed through his expression. "You should have let the damn thing die." Jed's jaw clenched. "You always were a coward, Earl." Earl's smirk twitched. "That so?" Jed nodded. "A real man wouldn't need a gun to handle his problems." Earl chuckled lowly. "And yet, here we are." He took another step closer, eyes narrowing. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Like this horse means something? Like you're fixing what happened years ago?" Jed's muscles tensed. "This ain't about Dusty, is it?" Earl continued, his voice quieter now, almost taunting. "It's about you. About the fact that you never could let go. That you never could get past what happened." Jed said nothing. But Earl wasn't done. "You want to know why I sold that horse?" he sneered. "Because he was yours. Because I saw the way you looked at him, like he was more than just an animal. Like he was family." He scoffed. "And I wanted to take that away from you." Martha gasped softly. Jed didn't move. His heart pounded, but he kept his breathing steady. Earl smiled coldly. "And now? Now I get to finish what I started." He raised the shotgun. Martha cried out, "Earl, don't." Bang! A shot rang out. But it wasn't from Earl's gun. Jed had fired first. Earl staggered back, dropping his shotgun, gripping his shoulder where blood now bloomed through his coat. His face twisted in pain and shock. Jed didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, raising his rifle again. Earl's hired men froze, eyes wide. "Go ahead," Jed growled. "See what happens next." The two men hesitated. One of them looked at Earl, then at Jed, then back again. Then they did what Jed expected them to do. They dropped their weapons and ran. Earl swayed on his feet, gasping, clutching his wounded arm. His shotgun lay useless at his feet. Jed lowered his rifle slightly, stepping closer, his voice low. "You stole from me once," he said. "But not again." Earl's breath hitched, his face pale. He looked at Dusty, the Mustang he had left for dead. The horse that refused to die. Then he looked at Martha. She stared back, her expression unreadable. Jed exhaled, his voice quiet. "This is the last time you walk away, Earl." A long silence stretched between them. Then Earl did what he had never done before. He turned his back and walked away. Earl stumbled as he walked away, one hand clutching his bleeding shoulder, the other hanging uselessly by his side. His boots dragged through the dirt, his breathing ragged. He had always been the one in control, the one who made others fear him. But not tonight. Jed didn't lower his rifle until Earl disappeared into the darkness of the woods. Only then did he take a breath, his grip loosening just slightly. Martha, standing frozen beside Dusty, finally let out a shaky exhale. "He won't forget this," she whispered. "He never does." Jed wiped the sweat from his brow. "I ain't worried about Earl's memory." He glanced toward the trees. "It's what comes next I'm thinking about." Martha looked at him, eyes dark with worry. "He's going to come back." Jed sighed, stepping toward Dusty. The Mustang stood still, his sides rising and falling with slow, uneven breaths. His body was weak, but his spirit? That hadn't broken. Jed ran a hand over the horse's neck, feeling the rough scars beneath his fingers. Dusty had survived Earl once before. And so had Jed. "We'll be ready," he murmured. But Martha's expression didn't change. "You don't understand, Jed. He won't just come back. He'll come back angry." Jed looked at her, then at Dusty, then back at the trees where Earl had disappeared. She was right. And it didn't take long for that truth to arrive. Hours later. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Jed sat on the porch of his cabin, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. Dusty lay resting near the fence, weak but safe. Martha sat inside, staring into the fire, lost in thought. Then came the sound Jed had been waiting for. The rustle of branches. The snap of twigs. He stood, lifting the rifle. The wind carried the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. But something was different this time. Jed didn't hear just boots. He heard hooves. Then, the sound of a rifle cocking. Jed didn't move. Didn't blink. A shadow appeared at the edge of the woods. Earl. But he wasn't alone. He had brought a horse. A stallion as dark as night, its muscles tensed, nostrils flared. And Earl, sitting atop the beast, wasn't carrying a shotgun this time. He had a whip in his good hand. Jed's jaw tightened. "This ain't over," Earl called out. His voice was hoarse, but there was something else in it now. Desperation. Jed lifted his rifle, stepping forward. "It's been over for a long time, Earl. You just didn't know it." Earl let out a harsh laugh. "You think you won? Think you're gonna keep that horse? He's mine. Always has been." Jed took another step. "He don't belong to you." Earl's eyes darkened. "Then let's see if he agrees." And then, he snapped the whip. The crack echoed through the night, and Dusty flinched. The Mustang's body tensed, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Memories flooded his mind, the pain, the years of forced labor, the beatings. But something else flooded through him too. Not fear. Not weakness. Rage. Before Jed could move, Dusty lunged forward. Earl's stallion reared, startled, but Dusty didn't stop. His weak legs should have given out beneath him, but they didn't. Not this time. Earl's eyes widened as the Mustang closed the distance, nostrils flared, hooves pounding against the earth. And then, Dusty struck. The Mustang rammed into Earl's horse, sending the stallion stumbling backward. Earl barely had time to grab the reins before he was thrown off. He hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his chest. The whip flew from his hand, landing uselessly in the dirt. Dusty stood over him now. The horse he had left for dead. The horse he had beaten, starved, and abandoned. The Mustang that should have died in the woods. But he hadn't. And now, he was looking down at his abuser. Earl gasped for breath, eyes wide with something he had never felt before, fear. Jed lowered his rifle and stepped closer. "You lost, Earl," he said quietly. "You been losin' for a long time." Earl lay there, panting, unable to speak. Jed turned to Dusty, running a hand over the Mustang's neck. "Come on, boy." And just like that, Dusty turned away. He didn't need revenge. He had one. Jed climbed into the saddle, and with one last glance at the man who had caused so much suffering, he nudged Dusty forward. Martha climbed onto the wagon, glancing once at Earl before looking away. And together, they rode away. Leaving Earl behind. Alone. With nothing, the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the open plains. The chill of night still clung to the air, but the warmth of day was pushing through, promising a fresh start. Dusty's hooves kicked up dirt as he trotted along, his gait steady and strong, no longer the fragile animal he had been the night before. Jed rode with a calmness he hadn't felt in years. The weight of the past, the guilt, the anger, seemed to lift with every step Dusty took. He wasn't just saving a horse anymore. He was saving himself. Martha sat beside him on the wagon, her face soft in the morning light, eyes distant but thoughtful. She hadn't said much since Earl had been left behind. The truth of what had happened between her and her husband hung between them, unspoken but understood. The road ahead of them stretched wide, empty, open. It was a road that didn't lead back to the past. It led somewhere new. As they rode, Martha finally spoke. "We could sell the ranch," she said quietly, her voice tentative. "Move somewhere else. Start over." Jed didn't look at her, but he nodded. "That's an option. But not today." She frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Jed smiled slightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Dusty's gonna need a good place to rest. And so am I." Martha paused, then nodded. She understood what he meant. The road ahead wasn't about running away. It was about healing. They didn't need to move far. There was an old, abandoned cabin up near the river, one that had been forgotten by everyone except the land itself. It was small, but it was solid. Quiet. Isolated. And it was perfect for the three of them. By mid-morning, they had reached the cabin. Dusty, still a little weary but stronger than before, led them to the barn. Jed unsaddled him, taking care to rub him down, speak to him softly. He'd saved this horse. But in doing so, he'd saved a part of himself, too. Martha brought over some blankets, setting them down in the cabin's main room. She started a fire, the crackling warmth filling the space. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. For the first time in a long while, Jed felt a flicker of hope. The world was changing. They were changing. Martha watched him as he stood in the doorway, looking out over the land. "You've done more than save a horse, Jed," she said quietly. "You've saved us both." Jed turned to her, his eyes softening. "We've both been runnin' from the same thing for too long." Martha stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then maybe it's time we stopped." Jed smiled, his heart light for the first time in years. I think you're right. He stepped out onto the porch, Dusty following him with slow, steady steps. The Mustang stood beside him, a bond between man and animal that could never be broken. They didn't need to explain it. They both knew. They had made it through the storm together. And now? Now they could rest. The legacy of Dusty. It wasn't long before word spread of what had happened. People who had known Earl, people who had heard the rumors of the cruel rancher and his mistreatment of animals, began to speak up. Jed wasn't looking for recognition. But slowly, the truth came out about the past, about the way Earl had stolen from him, abused the horses, and cared for nothing but his own greed. And then came the most surprising twist of all. One day, an old rancher from a neighboring town knocked on Jed's door. He had heard the story of Dusty, and he had a picture in his hand. It's funny, the rancher said, holding up the photo. I recognize this horse. He's not just any Mustang. This here's a special breed. They don't come around often. Jed studied the picture, then looked at Dusty, who stood nearby, grazing lazily. The Mustang's coat had grown shinier with each passing day. He was stronger now, healthier. This horse, the rancher continued, was supposed to be sold to a breeding farm. A good one. A valuable one. But years ago, I lost track of him. Jed's eyes widened. You mean to say, this horse? Dusty? The rancher nodded. His bloodline is rare. A prized stallion. The truth hit Jed like a bolt of lightning. Dusty hadn't just been a horse to him. He had been part of something bigger. A legacy. A future. Jed's smile grew. Guess he was always meant for more than just being a ranch horse, huh? The rancher chuckled. Seems so. He might just be worth something after all. Jed glanced at Dusty, who was grazing peacefully in the meadow. No, Jed said, his voice full of quiet pride. He was always worth something. To me, he's family. Dusty looked up at him, ears flicking as he walked back over. Jed reached out to rub the Mustang's neck. And in that moment, Jed realized that the greatest lesson had been learned, not just by him, but by everyone involved. The way we treat the weakest among us defines who we are. Jed had once thought that weakness meant failure, that strength meant survival. But now, after everything, he knew the truth. It wasn't about strength or weakness. It was about the will to survive. And Dusty had shown him that. Together, they were no longer bound by the past. They had found their way to a new future. A future where they could live in peace, stronger than ever before. And for the first time in his life, Jed knew he had done something right.